More than 8,000 people were murdered under the direct orders of a single man. Amon Göth, commander of the Pashov concentration camp, would shoot prisoners from the balcony of his villa every morning as a practice of marksmanship. It was neither military discipline nor enforcement of order. It was personal entertainment. Göth trained dogs to tear apart living prisoners, hung victims from meat hooks, and tortured them for weeks. He oversaw the liquidation of 3 Jewish ghettos, personally executing dozens of women and children with close-range gunfire. Thousands lived in constant terror under his rule, knowing that any moment could be their last. His cruelty was so extreme that even the SS arrested him for excessive brutality. The rise of a sadist. Youth and career. In the SS Vienna, 1908. In the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Amon Leopold Göth was born to a wealthy family of publishers. His father had built a prosperous publishing business, providing the family with a respectable position in Viennese society. Nothing in that bourgeois childhood foreshadowed the monster he would become. But Europe was on the brink of the abyss. When the First World War broke out, the young Göth was barely 6 years old. He grew up on a continent torn apart by war, where old empires were collapsing and new radical ideologies were emerging. Post-war Austria was a humiliated, fragmented, impoverished country. The multi-ethnic empire had been dismembered at Versailles, leaving behind a small German republic that many Austrians considered an artificial and unviable state. In this breeding ground of resentment and political radicalization, Göth found his identity. In 1931, at just 23 years old, he joined the Austrian Nazi Party. It was not a casual decision or a product of social pressure. The National Socialist movement was banned in Austria, which meant that his membership was a deliberate act of rebellion against the state. The following year, he joined the Schutzstaffel, the infamous SS, the paramilitary elite of the Nazi movement. During the 1930s, the SS in Austria operated underground, organizing secret cells, committing acts of sabotage and political violence. Göth actively participated in these illegal operations. His commitment to the Nazi cause was not merely ideological, he actively sought violent action. When the Austrian authorities intensified the persecution of local Nazis, Göth fled to Germany. In Germany, Hitler's regime had already consolidated its power. The SS, under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, expanded rapidly, transforming from a personal guard of the Führer into a vast apparatus of control and terror. Göth found in this structure the perfect environment for his ambitions. When the Anschluss incorporated Austria into the Reich in March of 1938, Göth returned triumphantly to Vienna. He married for the second time and established his family in Vienna, maintaining a facade of middle-class respectability. But his true commitment was to the SS. During the first years of the war, Göth rose in the hierarchy, demonstrating unwavering efficiency and loyalty. He was not an intellectual of the regime, nor a racial theorist. He was an executor, a man willing to get his hands dirty with the dirty work of the Reich. In 1942, Göth received an assignment that would define his legacy of horror. He was assigned to Lublin, in occupied Poland, at the headquarters of Operation Reinhard. This code name concealed the most diabolical plan of the Nazi regime, the total annihilation of the Jews of Poland. The architects of this operation had established 3 extermination camps in eastern Poland: Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. These were not traditional concentration camps or even slave labor camps. They were death factories designed with a single purpose: to murder human beings with industrial efficiency. Göth arrived in Poland with a clear understanding of his mission. His task was to participate in the systematic genocide of the Jewish people. In February 1943, he received his crucial appointment. He would become the 3rd SS officer to command the labor camp of Płaszów near Kraków. The location of the camp was deliberately symbolic and profane. The Nazis had chosen the site of 2 Jewish cemeteries in the suburb of Pashov to build their facility. The gravestones were uprooted, the graves desecrated, the bones of generations scattered. Over the remains of the recently deceased, barracks, watchtowers and barbed wire were erected. A fraudulent sign proclaimed "Labour Camp." But everyone knew the truth. Płaszów was a concentration camp, a site of terror and death. When Göth took command on the 11th of February in 1943, the camp housed approximately 2,000 prisoners. It was a relatively new facility, still expanding. On the surface, it could have been just another forced labour camp of the vast Nazi system that exploited millions of enslaved people. But Göth transformed Płaszów into something different. His personality, his methods, his particular sadism turned the place into a personal kingdom of absolute terror. Other camp commanders delegated violence to subordinates, maintaining a professional distance from the most brutal acts. Göth was different. He personally enjoyed the suffering he inflicted. He needed to see the fear in the eyes of his victims, hear their pleas, witness their agony. He measured more than 2 meters in height, an imposing physical figure that projected authority and threat even before acting. But it was not his height that terrified the prisoners. It was the certainty that at any moment, for any reason or for no reason at all, he could kill you. Death in Płaszów required no justification or process. It depended entirely on the whim of a single man. During the year and a half that Göth commanded Płaszów, more than 25,000 prisoners passed through the camp at its peak occupancy. 150,000 people passed through there as a transit camp to other destinations, primarily Auschwitz. Göth supervised every aspect of this machine of suffering with relentless meticulousness. The Nazi system had created an industrial infrastructure for genocide. Himmler had designed a hierarchy of death with specialized roles. But within that system, men like Göth found spaces to exercise violence that went beyond orders, satisfying deep sadistic impulses. It was not enough to kill. One had to humiliate, torture, and break the spirit before destroying the body. Göth had found his perfect vocation. The Płaszów field would be his stage, and he would play the role of a cruel god, an arbitrary dispenser of life and death, the absolute master of thousands of terrified souls awakening every morning without knowing if they would see the sunset. The kingdom of terror, methods of torture and murder in Płaszów. The dawn in Płaszów brought with it a ritual of horror. Each morning, as the prisoners prepared for the mandatory roll call in the assembly square, Amon Göth would step out onto the balcony of his villa, strategically located on an elevation overlooking the field. He did not go out to contemplate the new day. He went out to hunt. Göth kept rifles and pistols in his residence. Weapons he treated with the care of a dedicated athlete. From his elevated position, he observed the movement of the prisoners below, skeletal figures in striped uniforms moving between the barracks, forming lines, carrying supplies. He chose a target at random. He raised the rifle, aimed with deliberate calm, and shot. The prisoner fell. Sometimes death was instantaneous. Other times the wounded writhed on the ground, bleeding, agonizing, while the other prisoners remained motionless in formation, prohibited under penalty of death from aiding the fallen. This was neither an act of military discipline nor an imposition of order. It was target practice. Göth honed his aim using human beings as targets. He did it regularly, almost like a morning hobby. The prisoners quickly learned that moving too slowly, too quickly, or simply being within Göth's line of sight from his balcony could mean a sudden and inexplicable death. Joseph Bau, prisoner number 69,084, described Göth as a terrible and repugnant monster who instilled fear of death, who terrorized the masses and caused a constant chattering of teeth. Göth ruled the camp with extremes of cruelty that surpassed the understanding of any compassionate mind, employing tortures that sent his victims straight to hell. He kept 2 Great Danes, Rolf and Ralph, that he had specifically trained to attack and tear apart prisoners. These animals, naturally noble and gentle, were perverted through brutal training to become living weapons. A prisoner accused of any infraction could be brought before Göth, who would release the dogs with a simple command. The animals attacked with trained ferocity, ripping flesh, breaking bones, while Göth watched with satisfaction. A particularly revealing story involves the Jewish caretaker of the dogs, a prisoner whose only function was to feed and care for the animals. The dogs, responding to the caretaker's humane treatment, developed affection for him. They preferred his company to that of Göth. This preference enraged the commander. He could not tolerate that even his dogs showed more loyalty to a Jew than to him. He ordered the execution of the caretaker. The animals had committed the unforgivable crime of recognizing humanity where Göth saw only subhumans. The beatings were another routine tool of terror. Göth did not delegate this violence. He personally participated with evident pleasure. When a prisoner committed the slightest infraction, Göth personally administered the untold punishment. He repeatedly struck the victim's face, watching with satisfaction as the cheeks swelled and turned blue, how the teeth fell out, how the eyes filled with tears. Any prisoner whipped by Göth was forced to loudly count each lash of the whip. If he made a mistake in the counting, he had to start over from the beginning. This added humiliation revealed Göth's twisted psychology. It was not enough to inflict physical pain. It was necessary to destroy dignity, forcing collaboration in one's own degradation. During the interrogations, Göth developed particularly diabolical methods. His office contained a special hook installed in the ceiling. The accused were hung from this hook by their legs, suspended upside down. Then Göth would release his dogs. The suspended prisoner, helpless, was attacked by the animals while slowly turning. The screams filled the command building. Other prisoners working nearby listened and knew that any one of them could be next. Göth established the system of decimation, a brutal practice taken from ancient Rome. When a prisoner escaped from the camp, Göth ordered that all the prisoners in the fugitives group form a line. He made them count out loud. Every 10th person was pulled from the line and executed immediately. This practice had no real security purpose. Those who died had not participated in the escape. The objective was purely psychological, to break any sense of solidarity, making each prisoner fear that the actions of others would lead to their own death. The murders of Göth followed no comprehensible logic. During the morning formation in front of all the gathered prisoners, he shot a man simply because he was too tall. The prisoner had committed no infraction. His height, a physical characteristic over which he had no control, somehow offended Göth. The man fell wounded, dying. Göth approached the writhing body and urinated on it while the other prisoners looked on, horrified and powerless. A 16-year-old teenager named Haubenstock was hanged publicly on the 3rd of August, 1943, for the crime of singing a Russian song. Engineer Krautwirth was hanged for making comments about the camp guards. Göth justified both executions, claiming they incited mutiny among the Ukrainian guards, but everyone knew the truth. The men died because Göth decided they should die. No reasons were needed. A prisoner suffered from severe diarrhea, an illness common in the camp due to malnutrition and deplorable sanitary conditions. The man, unable to control himself, became dirty. When Göth discovered this, he forced the prisoner to eat his own feces. After forcing him to commit this act of supreme degradation, he executed him with a gunshot. The cruelty had no limits or purpose beyond the cruelty itself. Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, a young Jewish woman, was selected to serve as a personal maid in the villa of Göth. Her later testimony provided an intimate window into the character of the Yad commander. The first time she worked in the villa, Göth ordered her to iron a shirt. When it became clear that she did not know how to iron properly, Göth violently slapped her. He told her that the girls in Vienna knew how to iron shirts and asked why she could not. When Helen began to cry, he hit her again. She remembered that moment as the instant she realized she had stopped being a girl, that she had to mature instantly to survive. Living in the villa of Göth meant constant proximity to danger. Helen could be executed at any moment for any perceived mistake. Göth did not see his Jewish servants as human beings, but as disposable objects. In a moment of apparent generosity, he told her that if a Jewish girl was smart enough to clean a window on a sunny day, then she was smart enough to work for him. But this apparent approval could turn into a death sentence without warning. On the 7th of May in 1944, Göth organized a special health inspection, a Gesundheitsaction. All prisoners had to appear naked in the assembly square. Göth, along with his SS personnel and the camp doctor, would carry out a selection. Healthy prisoners capable of working would be assigned to labor tasks. The weak, sick, and elderly would be deported. The selection took place with music. Speakers installed in the square transmitted waltzes by Strauss, romantic ballads, love songs. The naked prisoners, exposed and vulnerable, marched before Göth while the elegant music floated over the grotesque scene. Banners hung in the square with the message, "For each prisoner, a suitable job." Göth and his officers examined the bodies, searching for signs of weakness, illness, malnutrition. A prisoner who was too thin was separated. A woman who was too old was sent aside. A man with a persistent cough was marked for deportation. The selection lasted for hours. In the end, 1,400 prisoners had been selected for deportation. Everyone knew what their fate was: Auschwitz, the gas chambers, annihilation. Göth personally intervened in this selection, ensuring that the necessary quotas were met. It was not enough to follow objective medical criteria. He decided who lived and who died based on momentary impulses. The cleansing of the camp created space for new prisoners, new victims for his reign of terror. The methods of execution in Płaszów varied. Some prisoners were hanged publicly in the parade ground, their bodies left swinging as a warning. Others were taken to the limestone quarry of the camp, where Göth personally participated in the execution of 300 people on the 14th of March 1942. The victims were forced to stand at the edge of the quarry and were shot, their bodies falling into the rocky depths. There was a special building for solitary confinement, where prisoners were tortured for weeks. In the crematorium of the camp, 1,100 prisoners, including at least one child, were strangled while hanging from meat hooks. Göth had designed a special barn for executions. Prisoners were taken there and executed with a bullet to the neck from behind, through a narrow slit in the wall. The executioner remained hidden. The victim did not see death coming. A prisoner named Poldek Pfefferberg captured the essence of the terror of Płaszów in a simple phrase: "When you saw Göth, you saw death." His presence meant immediate mortal danger. The prisoners learned to recognize the sound of his footsteps, the silhouette of his massive figure, the particular timbre of his voice. Every sense was tuned to detect his proximity, because survival depended on avoiding him, as much as possible. Anna Duklauer Perl, another survivor, expressed it directly. "I knew Göth. One day he hanged a friend of mine simply because he had been wealthy. He was the embodiment of evil." The casual murder of her friend, due to his previous economic status, showed how Göth mixed the official anti-Semitic ideology with personal sadism. The prisoner did not die because of resistance, escape, or sabotage. He died because Göth decided that his prior wealth justified his present execution. The uncertainty was, perhaps, the most effective psychological torture in Płaszów. The prisoners did not know if they would survive the day. A man could wake up, work his shift, return to the barrack, eat his meagre ration, and lie down. He had survived one more day. But another man, identical in behavior and situation, could be executed arbitrarily before noon. There was no way to guarantee safety, no strategy that ensured survival. Everything depended on the whimsical mood of Amon Göth. Göth had perfected the art of keeping prisoners in a state of constant anxiety. He did not establish clear rules that, if followed, would guarantee safety. The rules changed, or they did not exist, or they were applied selectively. One prisoner could be executed for moving too slowly in the morning formation. Another could be killed for moving too quickly. Logic did not rule in Płaszów, only the arbitrary will of a sadistic person with absolute power. The prisoners lived in a state of terror that surpassed the physical fear of death. It was a deeper existential fear, the understanding that one had fallen under the power of a human being without a trace of humanity, someone for whom the suffering of others was entertainment, for whom killing was as natural as breathing. In Płaszów, under the command of Amon Göth, hell was not a metaphor. It was the daily reality of thousands of souls trapped in the domain of a monster, the liquidations of the ghettos, active genocide. The role of Göth extended beyond the administration of Pashov. The SS had appointed him as the official in charge of the liquidation of ghettos in the Kraków region, a task he accepted with deadly enthusiasm. These operations were not simply administrative. Göth did not coordinate from a safe office while others carried out the orders. He actively participated, weapon in hand, personally killing men, women and children. On the 13th of March in 1943, Göth supervised the liquidation of the Kraków ghetto. For almost 2 years, thousands of Jews had been confined in the Podgórze district, a poor area of the city transformed into a walled ghetto. The conditions there were brutal: extreme overcrowding, starvation rations, rampant disease, constant terror. But for many residents, the ghetto represented an illusion of temporary security. As long as they remained there, as long as they were useful as workers, perhaps they would survive. That illusion was shattered in the early morning of the 13th of March. Units of the SS surrounded the ghetto. The loudspeakers transmitted orders. All residents had to leave their homes and present themselves in the streets. Those who could work would be transported to Płaszów. The others would be deported to the east. Göth walked through the streets of the ghetto with a gun in one hand and a whip in the other. His massive figure cast a threatening shadow over the terrified families emerging from the buildings. When he found someone too slow, too old, or simply for no reason, he shot. The bodies lay in the streets as the liquidation continued. It was documented that Göth personally shot approximately 50 children during this operation. They were not teenagers who could be mistaken for young adults. They were small children, of no labor value to the Reich, considered by Göth as inconvenient obstacles. He separated them from their parents and executed them with mechanical efficiency. Thousands of Jews deemed fit for work were taken to Płaszów. Several thousand more, the elderly, the sick and small children, were loaded onto train cars. The official destination was resettlement in the east. The real destination was Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the gas chambers awaited them. Hundreds more were executed directly in the streets of the ghetto during the evacuation. The ghetto of Tarnów had housed 25,000 Jews at the beginning of the war, approximately 45% of the city's population. During the years of occupation, thousands were deported in successive waves. By September 1943, approximately 8,000 people remained. Göth was assigned to liquidate this remaining ghetto. He arrived on the 2nd of September with 200 men from the SS. The operation began before dawn. Göth had divided the ghetto into two sections: Ghetto A for employed workers, Ghetto B for unemployed individuals. He first ordered everyone from Ghetto A to move to Ghetto B and gather in groups according to their employer. Each group held a sign with the name of the employer. Then Göth selected 300 people to form a Sauberungskolonne, cleaning column. These people would be responsible for collecting the corpses and cleaning the ghetto after the liquidation. The Jews gathered again, separated. Göth began to make selections. Those fit for heavy labor in Płaszów were sent to one side. The others were separated for deportation. During this selection, a young Jewish woman gathered the courage to approach Göth. She politely requested to be transferred to a different work group to be with her fiancé. It was a simple, human, understandable request. Göth pulled out his gun and shot her in the head. She fell dead instantly. Then he separated all the people again, continuing the selection as if nothing had happened. The testimony of Leon Lisa and other witnesses, recorded in the indictment of 1946, documented that Göth personally killed between 30 and 90 women and children during the liquidation of the Tarnów ghetto. The broad range of figures reflects the chaos of the operation and the difficulty of survivors in accounting for each individual murder amid the massive terror. The Jews of Tarnów, selected as fit for work, approximately 10,000 people, were loaded onto trains to Płaszów. The rest, approximately 4,000, were sent to Auschwitz. Less than half survived the journey. Of those who arrived alive, most were deemed unfit for forced labor and were gassed immediately upon arrival. The liquidation of the labor camp of Sebny near Jasło provided another scene for Göth's cruelty. This operation began on the 21st of September in 1943 and continued until February in 1944. On the first day, 700 people were killed. They were not executed in the camp itself. They were loaded onto trucks and transported to a forest in Tarnowiec, 3 kilometers from the camp, where they were shot in previously prepared pits. This operation was carried out by SS Hauptscharführer Grzimek, a specialist in liquidations who had previously cleared the ghettos of Lemberg and Rawa Ruska. But the operation was supervised by Commander Kellerman, acting under direct orders from Göth. During all these liquidations of ghettos and camps, Göth systematically enriched himself. The possessions of the murdered or deported Jews, furniture, furs, clothing, jewelry, tobacco, alcohol, were confiscated. According to Nazi regulations, these properties belonged to the German state, but Göth appropriated them for personal use or sold them on the black market. The Gestapo later discovered warehouses full of looted goods in Brunlitz, where Göth had sent them. His lover, Ruth Irene Calder, known as Majola, lived there surrounded by luxuries financed by the systematic theft of the belongings of the dead and the deported. Göth saw no contradiction in proclaiming loyalty to the Reich while robbing the state he vowed to serve. The hypocrisy was astounding. Göth operated within a regime that had turned mass murder into state policy, that had bureaucratized genocide. But even within this system of institutionalized evil, Göth stood out for his personal cruelty and his blatant corruption. Other SS officers expressed discreet disgust at his methods, not because they morally objected to genocide, but because Göth lacked the cold efficiency and professional discipline that Himmler was trying to instill in the SS. Göth was disorderly, impulsive, visibly sadistic. His behavior was an embarrassing reminder that the Nazi genocide was not just an abstract policy executed by neutral bureaucrats, but a concrete horror perpetrated by men who enjoyed suffering. The liquidations of ghettos under the command of Göth were scenes of chaos, terror, and indiscriminate violence. Families separated, children ripped from the arms of their mothers, elderly beaten to death in the streets. And in the midst of all this, the imposing figure of Göth, moving with brutal confidence, dispensing death with casual gestures, transforming human catastrophe into personal entertainment. For the Jews of Kraków, Tarnów, and the surrounding ghettos, Göth was the personification of the genocidal fate that the Nazis had decreed for them. He was not simply a cog in the machine of death, he was the hand that wielded the weapon, the voice that shouted the orders, the physical presence that ensured that the abstract policy of extermination became the concrete reality of blood and terror. The Fall, arrested by the SS and diagnosis of mental illness. On the 13th of September in 1944, Amon Göth was relieved of his command in Płaszów. It was not a routine transfer, nor a promotion. He was arrested by the SS themselves on charges of serious disciplinary violations. The irony was brutal. The man who had tortured and murdered thousands of Jews without consequences now faced a judicial process for crimes considered serious by his Nazi superiors. The charges against Göth did not mention his atrocities against prisoners. The SS did not arrest him for shooting people from his balcony, for training dogs to tear apart prisoners, for hanging teenagers, for executing children in ghetto liquidations. These acts, while extreme even by SS standards, were technically part of his official functions. Jews were enemies of the Reich, destined for annihilation. Killing them did not constitute a crime within the twisted logic of the Nazi system. The charges were different. Göth was accused of stealing Jewish property that, according to Nazi legislation, belonged to the German state. He had confiscated goods intended for the Reich for personal enrichment. He sold items on the black market that should have been delivered to the state treasury. This was the unforgivable violation. He was also accused of not adequately feeding the prisoners under his charge. This accusation was particularly hypocritical. The concentration camp system deliberately operated with starvation rations. But Göth had sold rations intended for the prisoners on the black market, pocketing the money. He had reduced the supplies even below the miserly levels officially stipulated. The Nazi state did not object to the starvation of the Jews. It objected to Göth personally benefiting from that starvation. A third charge involved violations of camp regulations regarding the treatment and punishment of prisoners. Göth had administered extreme punishments without proper documentation, not following established bureaucratic procedures. He had allowed unauthorized access to camp records by prisoners and non-commissioned officers. From the perspective of the SS, these were serious administrative failures that compromised operational security. The SS judge Georg Konrad Morgan was assigned to investigate the case. Morgan was a peculiar figure within the SS apparatus. He had made a reputation investigating corruption in the camp system. He had previously prosecuted Karl Koch, commander of Buchenwald, for embezzlement and unauthorized murder of prisoners. Morgan was not a humanitarian reformer. He was a bureaucratic purist who believed that genocide should be carried out with efficiency and discipline, not become a disorganized criminal enterprise for the personal gain of the commanders. The Morgan investigation uncovered the forced sexual relationship of Göth with Eleonore Hodys, an Austrian political prisoner and communist in Auschwitz. Hodis had become pregnant. Göth had imprisoned her in a punishment cell where one could only stand. She was subsequently released and underwent an abortion in a camp hospital in 1943. According to her later testimony, she barely evaded being selected for execution after these events. For the SS, this relationship constituted racial disgrace. The Nuremberg laws strictly prohibited sexual relations between Germans and people considered racially inferior. Although Hodis was not Jewish, she was a political prisoner, a category that was also prohibited. Morgan interviewed both Hodis and Göth, gathering evidence to prosecute the commander for this additional violation. But the case never progressed. The chaos of the war that was nearing its end disorganized the bureaucratic processes of the SS. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east, the Western Allies from the west. Administrative resources were concentrated on the collapsing war, not on internal investigations of corruption. The charges against Göth were filed away in the early part of 1945. During his detention, Göth's health deteriorated dramatically. Doctors diagnosed him with diabetes, exacerbated by years of excessive alcohol consumption, and a lifestyle characterized by constant stress, paranoia, and violence. They also diagnosed him with mental illness. The specific details remain unclear in historical records, but it is clear that the medical authorities of the SS deemed that Göth suffered from some form of severe psychological disorder. He was admitted to a psychiatric hospital of the SS in Bad Tölz, a facility in Bavaria. There he remained while the Reich collapsed around him. The Soviet armies were entering Poland, liberating the camps in the east. The American and British forces were crossing the Rhine. Berlin was becoming an urban battleground. In May 1945, American troops captured Bad Tölz. Among the patients in the psychiatric hospital, they found Amon Göth, former commander of Płaszów, a wanted war criminal and murderer of thousands. The Americans took him into custody. Initially, Göth might have expected that his mental illness would provide some form of special protection or treatment. But the Allies had uncovered the extent of the concentration camp system. They had liberated Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. They had seen the piles of corpses, the skeletal survivors, the gas chambers, the crematoria. Global outrage demanded justice. Poland claimed Göth. Płaszów was in Polish territory. Its victims were mostly Polish Jews. The restored Polish government, now under Soviet influence, but operating with its own courts, demanded the extradition of Nazi war criminals who had operated on Polish soil. The Americans agreed. In July 1946, Göth was transferred to Polish custody. The journey back to Poland must have been a dizzying psychological descent. Less than 2 years earlier, Göth had been the absolute master of Pashov, a cruel god who whimsically decided who lived and who died. Now he was a sick and defeated prisoner, being transported to face trial for his crimes. The arrest of Göth by the SS reveals the deeply corrupt and hypocritical nature of the Nazi system. The regime had institutionalized mass murder, turning genocide into state policy. But it was outraged when its officials stole from the state treasury while carrying out that genocide. You could kill thousands of Jews without consequences, as long as you handed over their possessions to the state instead of keeping them. This bureaucratic hypocrisy also exposes an uncomfortable truth about the Nazi system. It was not simply a fanatical ideological regime, it was also a massive criminal enterprise, where figures like Göth mixed genocidal fanaticism with ordinary crime, wrapping common theft in the rhetoric of racial purity. The diagnosis of mental illness raises complex questions about responsibility and the nature of evil. The Nazi system provided a context where sadistic personalities could flourish, where the darkest impulses of men like Göth found not only permission, but institutional encouragement. However, mental illness does not equate to innocence. Thousands of men operated within the concentration camp system. Most committed terrible atrocities. Yet even within that context of normalized horror, Göth was notable for his personal cruelty, his evident enjoyment of suffering, his need to participate directly in violence. He chose these behaviors repeatedly, day after day, for years. Now, defeated, sick, arrested, Göth faced a different kind of trial. He would not be judged by SS bureaucrats worried about procedures and embezzlement. He would be judged by representatives of the nations he had helped to devastate, in front of survivors of his atrocities, under laws that recognized his acts as crimes against humanity. The Kraków trial. I only followed orders. On the 11th of March in 1947, the trial of Amon Göth began in Warsaw. The auditorium of the Polish Teachers' Union in the Płaszów district had been selected as the venue out of practical necessity. It was the only space in the war-torn capital capable of hosting a trial of this magnitude. Approximately 500 people filled the room daily. Simultaneous translation equipment was installed, allowing the process to be followed in several languages. The composition of the audience was profoundly significant. Most were former prisoners of Auschwitz and Pashov, survivors who had directly experienced the Nazi camp system, people who had lost entire families. For them, this trial was not an abstract legal exercise. It was a direct confrontation with one of the perpetrators, an opportunity to testify, a search for some form of justice in a world that had allowed their suffering. Göth was accused before the Supreme National Court of Poland on 5 separate charges. The first, to kill Jewish prisoners by beating, torture or attack by trained dogs. The second, participation in the final liquidation of the Kraków Ghetto. The third, participation in the liquidation of the Tarnów Ghetto, where he personally shot, beat and tortured residents. The fourth, participation in the liquidation of the Zebny labor camp. The fifth, theft of money and items from the victims. The accusation estimated that Göth was responsible for the death of approximately 8,000 Jews. This figure represented only the murders directly attributable to him, not the total number of people who died in Płaszów during his tenure, or who were deported to death from the ghettos he liquidated. The actual number of victims for which Göth was responsible was significantly higher. The prosecutors presented extensive evidence. Official documents demonstrated his authority over Płaszów and his participation in the liquidation of ghettos. Photographs showed him in the camp, in his villa overlooking the prisoner camp. Administrative records detailed the deportations he had organized. Gestapo reports documented the stolen assets found in his possession. But the most devastating testimony came from survivors. One after another, men and women who had been prisoners in Płaszów took the stand. They described the morning shootings from Göth's balcony, the trained dogs for attack, the selections where Göth decided who would live and who would die, the public executions, the torture in the command office, the constant and unpredictable terror of life under his rule. Helen Jonas Rosenzweig testified about her experience as a maid in the villa of Göth. Leon Lezer described the liquidation of the ghetto of Tarnów. Joseph Bau recited the atmosphere of paralyzing fear in the camp. Mitek Pemper, who had worked in Göth's office and had access to confidential documents, provided detailed evidence of the untold, camp's operations and the actions of its commander. The witnesses did not only recount events, they conveyed the psychological impact of Göth's terror. They described how the sound of his footsteps caused instant panic, how his appearance in the square made thousands of people tremble, how prisoners developed desperate strategies to avoid attracting his attention, how the constant uncertainty eroded sanity itself. The court listened in stunned silence as the witnesses reconstructed the reality of Płaszów. Almost 2 years had passed since the liberation of the camps. The Nuremberg trials had exposed the bureaucratic machinery of genocide. But the specificity of the testimony, the description of Göth's everyday and personalized cruelty, impacted even those who believed they were prepared. Göth's defense strategy was predictable. His lawyer argued that he had acted under higher orders. The Reich had decreed the final solution. Himmler had given specific instructions on the treatment of Jewish prisoners. Göth was simply an officer fulfilling his duty. Any death sentence that was carried out was done with the knowledge and authorization of his superiors. As the camp commander, he had disciplinary jurisdiction over the prisoners. The punishments he administered were within his legal authority according to the German regulations in effect at that time. This argument, "I was just following orders," had become the standard defense for Nazi defendants. It reflected an attempt to blur individual responsibility within the collective guilt of the system. If everyone was simply following orders, who was really responsible? The court rejected this argument outright. The Polish judges declared that there was no justification under the law of war for the liquidation of defenseless civilians. The fact that a criminal regime ordered crimes did not absolve those who executed them. Superior orders could be a mitigating circumstance in some context, but they did not provide complete defense against charges of mass murder and torture. Furthermore, the evidence clearly demonstrated that Göth had gone beyond any orders. No superior directive required him to shoot at random prisoners from his balcony as morning entertainment. No order demanded that he train dogs to tear apart prisoners. No instruction specified that he should hang victims from meat hooks and set dogs upon them. No official policy mandated that he urinate on dying prisoners. These actions were not the implementation of genocidal policy. They were expressions of personal sadism. Göth had found in the Nazi system a perfect opportunity to satisfy deep, violent impulses. The regime provided the permissive context, but Göth supplied the enthusiasm and cruel creativity. The behavior of Göth during the trial was remarkable. Unlike some Nazi defendants who adopted postures of offended dignity or complete denial, Göth displayed provocative indifference. He accepted responsibility for what had occurred. In Płaszów, he admitted that he had had authority and permission to do everything he did. He simply insisted that he had been following orders received from superiors. This attitude revealed much about his mentality. He did not express remorse because he genuinely did not feel that he had done anything wrong. From his distorted perspective, he had been a loyal officer carrying out difficult but necessary tasks. The Jews were enemies of the Reich, destined for destruction. He had facilitated that destruction. The verdict was announced on the 5th of September 1946. Göth was found guilty of all charges. The court found him guilty of membership in the Nazi Party and of personally ordering the imprisonment, torture and extermination of individuals and groups of people. Crucially, he was also convicted of murder, becoming the first person convicted of this specific charge in a war crimes trial. This legal distinction was significant. Other Nazi defendants had been convicted of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, but Göth was explicitly convicted of homicide, killing, mutilating, and personally torturing a substantial, although not fully identified number of people. The court acknowledged that beyond his administrative role in the genocidal system, Göth was personally a multiple murderer. The sentence was death by hanging. Göth showed no visible emotional reaction upon hearing the verdict. The mask of indifference remained. Other condemned had cried, protested, pleaded. Göth simply accepted the verdict as if it were an administrative matter that did not concern him emotionally. The Krakow trial established significant precedents for international law. It affirmed the principle that state officials can be personally responsible for crimes committed under the colour of official authority. It rejected the defence of superior orders as complete absolution. It distinguished between bureaucratic participation in systemic crimes and personal perpetration of sadistic violence. For the survivors in the room, the verdict provided a measure of justice, although no sentence could restore what was lost or erase the trauma experienced. Seeing Göth declared guilty, sentenced to death, officially recognized as a criminal, held profound symbolic value. But the true culmination of the legal process was yet to come. The death sentence was to be carried out. And in the execution, in the final moments of Amon Göth, a final and powerful contrast would be revealed between the terror he had dispensed for years and his own confrontation with death. The execution. 3 attempts with the rope. The execution date was set for the 13th of September, 1946. The chosen location had deliberate symbolic significance: Montelupich prison in Kraków, a short distance from where Płaszów had been. Göth would die near the place where he had tortured and murdered thousands. The Polish authorities made a conscious decision regarding the nature of the execution. Months earlier, in the summer of 1946, Arthur Greiser, Gauleiter of Wartheland, had been executed publicly in Poznań. His hanging on the slopes of the citadel drew massive crowds. The atmosphere had been almost festive, with families bringing children, vendors circulating among the crowd, selling ice cream, soft drinks, and sweets. After the execution, people fought for pieces of the hangman's rope as macabre souvenirs. Intellectuals and officials of the church had protested to the authorities. They argued that transforming executions into public spectacles degraded the process of justice, turning a solemn act of legal responsibility into morbid entertainment. The Ministry of Justice agreed. For the execution of Göth, access would be strictly limited. Only official witnesses would be admitted. German prisoners of war were ordered to build the gallows. They worked from dawn, erecting a wooden platform with a trapdoor. The irony of having Germans construct the execution instrument of one of their own SS officers did not go unnoticed. Some historians speculate that these same prisoners of war may have served as executioners, although the records are not definitive on this point. Security was extreme. No one could enter without a special pass. Armed and uniformed guards were positioned throughout the perimeter. The event would attract approximately 100 official witnesses, former prisoners from Pashov, prosecutors, officials from the Ministry of Justice, representatives of the State Prosecutor's Office, and staff from the Bureau of Security. Göth arrived at 8 in the morning. He was first taken to the building that once housed the commander's office of the prison. There he requested a cup of coffee. The request was granted. He drank the coffee calmly, one last ordinary indulgence before his imminent death. He was then taken to a cell in the bunker, the camp jail in block number 11, known as the death block. There he waited for the final 2 hours. At 10 o'clock in the morning sharp, the guards opened the cell. Göth emerged with remarkable calmness. The witnesses described his behavior as controlled, almost serene. He walked with energetic steps. Some said he was almost swaggering along the main street of the camp. His hands were handcuffed behind his back, which gave him an upright posture, chest forward, head held high. He had requested the presence of a priest. This request had been granted. Father Tadeusz Zaremba, a Salesian from Oświęcim, waited at the gallows. Göth, who had dispensed death without mercy, allowing the victims no spiritual comfort, was now seeking religious consolation for himself. Göth arrived at the gallows. Because of his hands cuffed behind his back, the executioners had to help him onto the stool placed over the trap door. He stood there, looking at the audience of witnesses. Some were survivors whom he had personally tortured. Others had lost entire families in Płaszów. Father Zaremba approached the gallows. He began the final prayers. The executioner prepared the rope. Then something extraordinary happened that would become the most memorable detail of the execution. The executioner placed the rope around Göth's neck. With a movement of his head, Göth adjusted the position of the rope. This careful and deliberate gesture suggested a man maintaining control even on the absolute threshold. Then the executioner kicked the stool. The body of Göth fell. It struck the trap door, which opened. Göth was left hanging. But something was wrong. The length of the rope had been incorrectly calculated. An appropriate hanging execution requires that the fall breaks the neck instantly, causing a quick death. If the rope is too long, the body hits the ground. If it is too short, death comes by slow strangulation, prolonging the agony. In this first attempt, the length of the rope was incorrect. Göth did not die immediately. They had to hoist him back up. The executioner, evidently nervous or incompetent, adjusted the rope and tried again. The second attempt also failed. Again, the length of the rope was incorrect. Göth was hoisted for the second time, still alive, now having experienced 2 failed drops. The witnesses watched with a mix of horror and morbid fascination. Only on the third attempt did the executioner finally manage to get the correct length of the rope. Göth fell. The rope tightened. This time it worked. Father Zaremba began to recite the prayer for the dying, while Göth's body hung from the gallows. It was 10:18 in the morning. A doctor approached to check the vital signs. At 10:21 in the morning, 13 minutes after Göth had gotten on the stool for the first time, the doctor officially pronounced death. The body was lowered. The remains of Amon Göth were probably cremated, although the records are not completely explicit. If he was cremated, his ashes were thrown into the Vistula River, scattered in the water, denying him any identifiable monument or resting place. The man who had built a kingdom of terror disappeared without a trace, without a grave, without a physical mark that he had existed. The Polish press noted the execution briefly. Apparently, the newspapers were prohibited from publishing eyewitness accounts. The state wanted to document that justice had been served without creating sensationalism. It was the last public execution, even with a limited audience, carried out in Poland. The photographs of the execution, taken by the press photographer Stanisław Dąbrowiecki, were kept secret for decades in communist Poland. The negatives were stored in a safe at the Ministry of Justice, but disappeared at some unknown time. Only 11 prints survived, providing rare and valuable visual documentation of the event. The fate of Göth's family adds a tragic coda to the story. His wife, upon learning what her husband had done, the magnitude of his crimes, committed suicide. The confrontation with the truth, the understanding that she had been married to a mass murderer, was unbearable. Years later, in 2002, Göth's daughter, Monika Hertwig, published memoirs recounting her struggle to reconcile the knowledge of her father's crimes with her experience of him as an absent but idealized parent by her mother. The 3 failed execution attempts have generated various interpretations. Some historians view them as mere incompetence on the part of the executioner under pressure. Others speculate about deliberate sabotage, although there is no evidence to support this theory. The truth is probably more prosaic. Execution by hanging requires precise calculations based on the weight of the condemned, the length of the drop, and the force of the impact. The executioner, perhaps nervous due to the importance of the moment, simply made technical mistakes. But, regardless of the mechanical explanation, The three attempts became part of Göth's narrative legacy. The man who had killed with brutal efficiency for years, who had perfected methods of torture, who had treated death as casual entertainment, finally faced his own death in a clumsy, prolonged, almost farcical manner. Although historical records do not explicitly document that Göth pleaded during the execution itself, his request for a priest, his final consumption of coffee, his careful adjustment of the rope, all suggest a man confronting death very differently than he had dispensed it. The sadist who had never shown mercy was now seeking the ordinary comforts of human compassion in his final moments. Amon Göth died at the age of 37. He had lived a relatively short life, but had left a disproportionate legacy of suffering. Thousands of people bore physical and psychological scars from his cruelty. Thousands more had been murdered under his command. Entire communities had been destroyed by the liquidations he oversaw, and all of this had been carried out by a man who, in the end, faced his own mortality without the absolute control he had exercised over others. Legacy and memory, Schindler's List and the forgotten perpetrator. For almost 5 decades after his execution, Amon Göth remained a relatively obscure figure outside of specialized circles. Holocaust historians knew his name. The survivors of Pashov carried traumatic memories of his reign of terror. But for the general public, even for those with basic historical knowledge of the Second World War, Göth was unknown. This relative forgetfulness was not unique. Thousands of Nazi perpetrators had participated in the Holocaust. Public memory tended to focus on high-profile figures: Hitler, Himmler, Göring, Goebbels. The main defendants at Nuremberg had been widely publicized. Adolf Eichmann, captured by Israeli agents in Argentina and tried in Jerusalem in 1961, had received worldwide media coverage. But individual camp commanders, particularly those executed immediately after the war, faded from public consciousness. Göth was mostly forgotten, a monster among many monsters, his particularity lost in the statistical enormity of genocide. The situation changed dramatically in 1982 with the publication of Schindler's Ark by Australian author Thomas Keneally. The book told the true story of Oskar Schindler, an industrialist and member of the Nazi Party who had saved approximately 1,200 Jews by employing them in his enamelware factory and subsequently in an armaments factory in Brünnlitz. Keneally had discovered the story by chance. While shopping in a leather goods store in Beverly Hills in 1980, he had met Leopold Pfefferberg, a survivor of Schindler. Pfefferberg had been searching for years for someone to tell Schindler's story. He convinced Keneally to research and write the book. The narrative required an antagonist. Schindler's story gained dramatic meaning in contrast to the alternative faced by his Jewish workers. That alternative had a specific face: Amon Göth. Schindler's factory had initially been located next to the Płaszów camp. Schindler had deliberately cultivated a relationship with Göth, drinking with him, bribing him, flattering him, to ensure better treatment for his workers. Keneally's book brilliantly juxtaposed the two figures. Schindler, the unlikely savior, a womanizer, drinker, opportunist who evolved into moral heroism. Göth, the archetypal villain, sadistic, brutal, embodying all the evil of the Nazi system. Schindler's List was a moderate commercial and critical success. It won the Booker Prize, the prestigious British Literary Award, but its truly massive impact would come a decade later when Steven Spielberg adapted it for film. Schindler's List was released in 1993. Spielberg, the most commercially successful director in Hollywood, had postponed this project for years, doubting his ability to do justice to such a grim subject. He finally felt ready. He filmed in black and white, on real locations in Poland, including parts of the still existing Płaszów camp. For the role of Göth, Spielberg chose Ralph Fiennes, a British actor who was relatively unknown at the time. Fiennes immersed himself in the role with disturbing intensity. He studied photographs of Göth, read testimonies from survivors, and gained weight to match Goeth's massive figure. His performance captured the casual banality of Goeth's cruelty, the way he alternated between explosive violence and ordinary conversation. The most iconic scene of the film shows Göth on the balcony of his villa, rifle in hand, shooting at prisoners below while his Jewish maid, Helen Hirsch, watches in terror. This sequence, built directly from historical testimonies, crystallized Goeth's monstrosity for millions of viewers. Another powerful scene presents Göth violently beating Helen after a drunken confession of attraction towards her. The moment exposes the central psychological contradiction of Nazi perpetrators who maintained an ideology of racial purity while sexually exploiting victims. Göth could not reconcile his desire for a Jewish woman with his belief that Jews were subhuman. The confusion manifested itself as violence. Fiennes' performance was universally acclaimed. He received an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. He won the BAFTA award in the same category. The American Film Institute subsequently placed Fiennes' Amon Göth in the 15th position on its list of the 50 greatest villains in film history, the first based on a real person. The impact of the film on public knowledge of Göth was dramatic and immediate. Suddenly, millions of people who had never heard his name knew who he was. The character became iconic, although many viewers did not completely separate the cinematic portrayal from the actual historical man. An incident during the filming underscored the traumatic power of the story. Mila Pfefferberg, wife of Leopold Pfefferberg, and survivor of Płaszów, visited the set. When she was introduced to Ralph Fiennes, dressed in an SS uniform, she began to tremble uncontrollably. Although she intellectually knew that Fiennes was a British actor playing a role, the sight of the uniform, the physical resemblance to Göth, triggered a visceral, traumatic response. Schindler's List won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. It was seen by tens of millions of people around the world. It became a mandatory educational tool in many schools. The film achieved what decades of historical education had not, making the Holocaust emotionally immediate and personally relevant to a massive audience. The physical legacy of Płaszów presents a marked contrast with other concentration camp sites. Auschwitz has been preserved as a museum and memorial. Dachau, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen were transformed into educational sites with exhibitions, guides, and explanatory markers. But Płaszów was mostly abandoned. Before the final evacuation in 1944, the Nazis had attempted to destroy evidence. They demolished barracks, dismantled parts of the barbed wire fence, and tried to eliminate traces of what had happened there. In the following decades, vegetation reclaimed the site. By the 90s, Płaszów was mostly an empty field. There were no maps, signs, plaques, or explanatory photographs. Some small monuments were eventually erected, but Płaszów remains one of the least remembered concentration camp sites. Urban development continued around the former camp. Modern apartments were built nearby. The site became an anomaly, an undefined green space in the midst of urban expansion. The personal history of Göth's family adds another dimension to the legacy. Monika Hertwig, his daughter, was born in 1945, shortly after Göth's arrest. She grew up without knowing her father. Her mother, Ruth Calder, built a narrative of Göth as a patriotic officer and loving father who had been unjustly persecuted after the war. This fiction collapsed when Monika eventually discovered the truth. The confrontation with the knowledge that her father had been a mass murderer caused a deep psychological crisis. In 2002, she published a memoir titled Must I Love My Father or Not? The book explores her struggle to reconcile filial bonds with moral horror, accepting that her very existence was intertwined with historical monstrosity. Hertwig later met with Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, her father's maid, in a documented meeting. The conversation between the perpetrator's daughter and the surviving victim was emotional and complex. Hertwig sought understanding and perhaps some form of atonement for her father's sins. Jonas Rosenzweig provided testimony but also compassion, acknowledging that Monika was not responsible for her father's actions. The case of Göth invites broader reflection on typologies of Holocaust perpetrators. Academics distinguish between different categories. Some, like Adolf Eichmann, were bureaucrats whose participation in the genocide was primarily administrative. Others, like Rudolf Höss, were camp administrators who oversaw mass murder but maintained personal distance from direct violence. Göth represented a third category, the active sadist who not only carried out genocide but also derived personal pleasure from the suffering inflicted. He was not content with giving orders from an office. He required direct participation, visual testimony of pain, personal exercise of lethal violence. This distinction is important for understanding the nature of evil. The Nazi system provided institutional structure for genocide, but within that structure, individuals had choices about how they exercised their power. Some minimized direct contact with victims. Others, like Göth, maximized that contact, transforming genocidal policy into personal, sadistic ritual. The final legacy of Göth is a warning about what happens when personal sadism meets institutional permission. The Nazi regime created contexts where men with pre-existing sadistic tendencies could act them out without consequences, even with official approval. Göth repeatedly chose cruelty when less brutal alternatives were available. Other camp commanders operated with less visible personal violence. Göth could have delegated executions to subordinates. He could have minimized his presence in ghetto liquidations. He could have administered Płaszów without turning it into a personal theatre of torture. He did none of these things. The story of Amon Göth, from his Viennese youth to his clumsy execution in Kraków, encapsulates uncomfortable truths about human nature. It shows how political systems can unleash the worst instincts of individuals. It demonstrates that extreme evil does not always stem from abstract ideology, but from concrete personalities who take pleasure in causing pain. And finally, in his last moments, in his search for spiritual comfort, in the 3 failed attempts of his execution, Göth reveals that even the most brutal sadists face death as vulnerable mortals. The terror he dispensed for years finally caught up with him. The man who had never shown mercy was now seeking the smallest comforts of human compassion. It was too late, both for him and for his thousands of victims. But justice, although imperfect and delayed, finally arrived